video, I'm going to talk a little bit about circular needles and how they can be used and what they're used for. And if you're an experienced knitter, this is probably old stuff for you. You've been using circular needles for a while and you know how they work. But I get this question plenty of times from beginner knitters who really have only used straight needles. And straight needles are great and they have their purpose, and I know people really love them. I personally never use straight needles, and so I want to talk a little bit about why I don't use straight needles and how I use circular needles instead, and how circular needles work for different projects. Now, these are actually my favorite straight needles, even though I don't use them much, because they're really short, and so when I'm knitting with them, they're not sticking out very much from the chair that I'm sitting in, which is fine. But really, even with flat knitting like this is a log cabin blanket square, I pretty much do everything on 24-inch circulars. And the way that this works, you don't have to knit a tube when you're knitting with circular knitting. When you're knitting with circular needles. I need to keep knitting and needles and those words straight. You can just knit across, and then without joining in the round, when you finish a row, you just turn your work. And to turn your work, to knit a flat piece that isn't a tube, you just swap your needles in your hand to turn your work, and then you go the other direction. You just take the empty needle into your right hand and work the other direction. I know that for experienced knitters, it seems like a funny question. How do I not join in the round? But I get this question so often. You knit across, swap the needles in your hand, put the empty needle, sort of the empty needle, into your right hand and knit across. Okay, that's how you knit a flat piece on circular needles. For more the way you think circular needles would work would be something like this, in knitting a tube. And this is needles from a 16-inch needle set. I have a set of needles that is an interchangeable set with all of the needle sizes and these little short 16-inch cords. This is one of my favorite finds for all of my knitting materials, are these 16-inch needles, because it's so quick to knit a little tube around and around, like for a hat or for the sleeve of a sweater or something else. The differences with the 16-inch needle sets is that the needles are much shorter than you have for other cord lengths, longer cord lengths. And people ask me pretty regularly what I think of the 9-inch needle sets. And while I think 16 inch is perfect, I think when you get down into a smaller cord length, the needles end up having to be so short to accommodate the little short cord length, there's almost nothing to hang on to. So there's my opinion on those. 16 inches perfect, and smaller than that, it gets difficult. But if you want to knit a tube that's smaller than this, and you can switch to double-pointed needles, or you can do magic loop knitting, where you have the extra cord hanging out. I would not want to do magic loop on needles this short, but you have the extra loop hanging out. I can actually give you a link here to my simple magic loop video, which shows you how to use a long cord length for a small bit of knitting. And when we're talking about different cord lengths, something that's definitely going to play a role is interchangeable sets, like I was just talking about with that 16-inch set. This is a regular interchangeable set for the shortest cord length being 24 inches. And this is a set of needles, a set of needle sizes, a range of sizes, and different cord lengths. And you can match up the cord length that you need with the needle size that you need, and it gives you, endless possibilities. You have pretty much everything you need. So when you're in the yarn shop and you're buying yarn and you have to think, oh, do I have a pair of 32-inch size 7s? Yes, you know you do. These end up being a good value. This is pretty much all that I use. I don't even really keep fixed needles around anymore. Everything I use is interchangeable anymore. And when we're talking about interchangeable, this is a 32-inch cord. Let me back up. This is an interchangeable set with a 16-inch cord. This is my standard for everything, cord length, 24-inch. I use it for almost everything. But then when you get up into 32-inch cords, this is what you want to use if you're knitting a large sweater or a men's sweater, this is about right, the right size of tube for that. And that's why it's handy to have 32-inch cords for that. This is also good if you're knitting a baby blanket. This is long enough to accommodate all the stitches for a baby blanket for flat knitting. But for tube knitting, you can see it's a man's torso is bigger than this, but the stitches squish around to be the perfect cord length for something like that. And then when we get into really long cord lengths, and this is where the interchangeable set is handy because you're not going to use a cord length this long for very many projects. So it's nice to have the interchangeable set where you can just disconnect the cord when you're not using it. I think this is a 40-inch. Yeah, this must be a 40-inch cord length. And this is cumbersome unless you have a lot of stitches on the needle. I can't actually think of a reason why you'd need to knit a tube this big, but because really for any size person you can fit stitches, a lot of stitches on a 32-inch. This is a lot of cord length and probably most appropriate if you're knitting a really big blanket, like a king-size bedspread or something. Or if you're doing magic loop on a really large size sweater, you have enough extra cord to hang off. I can see that would be handy if you didn't have the cord length you need otherwise. But so using, having an interchangeable set or having a 16-inch set or using the needles for flat knitting, it makes all the difference in the world what cord length you're attaching to it to make it work for the project you are working on. One last thing I want to say about my preference for using circular needles for flat knitting is hand fatigue. And I'm not an expert on hand fatigue, but I can tell you what works for me. When I'm knitting something that eventually ends up getting pretty heavy, and this won't get very heavy, but when I'm knitting something like that on straight needles, all of the weight of the knitting is out here on the ends of these needles, and it does cause hand fatigue and some wrist strain for me. But if I'm knitting something heavy on circular needles, the weight of the knitting is actually in my lap, and which takes the strain off my wrists and off my hands and lets me keep going for longer. Anyway, I think that is a basic overview of circular needles and how and when to use them. I hope that helps all the new knitters. Good luck.